Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So thanks to everyone who listened to our commentary last week on the debate. And now, well, some early polling is showing that there's been, the race has tightened, frankly, and tight race has already even tightened even more. So Harris showed the world, in my opinion, that she's not as ditzy as was her reputation with all her nonsensical lines over the years. And she actually showed that she was a likable person, contrary to all the rumors stemming from all the resignations and turnover of her staff. So it's not hard to understand that the polls have flipped to now slightly favoring her, both in the nationwide polls and the battleground states. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, that's right. And it seems like she's doing better in Wisconsin and Michigan. But it seems like Pennsylvania is being kind of stubborn and is still kind of a tilt Trump state. We're, of course, sitting here passing judgment on the individual states. If you look at the states, they're all 1 point to one candidate or 2 points to the other candidate. And so what it means is really anything can happen. Turnout is going to matter the most in all of these states. And is there an October surprise? Is there something that we're not expecting coming on? You know, they announced last week, Mr. Trump did at least, that he's not going to do another debate. So really the only major event of the campaign, if you consider it a major event, is the upcoming vice presidential debate on the 1st. But you're right. You know, Harris did what she needed to do as far as being a presidential figure and being seen as a president, but she still has work to do on policy, particularly economic policy. If she can thread that needle, you know, these little states that are 1 point to Trump, 2 points to Trump, well, maybe some of those states could become 1 point to Harris. It's that close, you know, that you're really going to have 50 to 75 or 100,000 voters in these key states combined deciding the next president.
Well, you know, that's why, Tim, I'm going to go out on a limb here. And I think there's going to be a Trump victory because the economy, as you mentioned, inflation, the strain on communities that the border issues are causing, all these bread and butter issues are what's really going to matter, in my mind, to the voters. And right now, talk about October surprise, there are a lot of hot spots around the world. Should any of these hot spots get worse, some of these war zones, I think voters are going to think back to the days of Trump when there was much more global stability. I'm still predicting a Trump victory. What about you?
I'm not predicting anyone's victory. I think it could go either way. And it kind of speaks to another thing that really didn't come up much in the aftermath of the debate and in thinking about it is the double negatives, the people who aren't fans of Trump or Harris and previously weren't fans of Biden. You know, I think those voters had made up their mind to fire Biden. The question is, are they ready to hire Harris? And I think the kind of lack of discussion of economic policy and specifics in the debate probably hurt her quest with those voters. But then it gets to something that really hasn't come up with. You know, Trump and Harris aren't the two candidates on the ballot. There are several other third-party candidates. And in some of the key states like Pennsylvania and Georgia, you know, third-party candidates are polling at 1 or 2% in the polls, and they could make the difference in the election.
And Tim, you got an interesting letter from a listener. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so one of our listeners wrote in and said, obviously appreciated the discussion we had of the presidential debate last week, but then mentioned there are other candidates on the ballot that we would welcome hearing some discussion of because, you know, the presidential debate system, and the listener's right, it does perpetuate the two-party system. And there are a lot of other minor party candidates who are running, some of whom can make a difference, as I just mentioned, in the key states. And probably the leading third-party candidate is Chase Oliver. Chase Oliver is the Libertarian Party candidate. You may have known him from in the last election in Georgia. He was the Libertarian Senate candidate, and he forced the key Senate race into a runoff in January, which ultimately you saw Reverend Warnock win the Senate seat, and that gave Democrats control of the Senate. So that 2% of the vote or so that Chase Oliver got in the Georgia Senate race really was huge in terms of the direction of our national politics. And something else not to sneeze about is that Libertarians are on the ballot in 34 states. And Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico, who was the Libertarian candidate in 2016, remember, he got 4.4 million votes. So there is the potential that someone like a Chase Oliver could get a significant number of votes. So I did a little research on Chase Oliver to kind of see where he stands, and sounds like he would be a PRI pamphlet. He talks, when asked kind of where he is philosophically, he talks about classical liberalism. He talks about limited government. He talks about things in terms of liberty. He talks about reducing government involvement in the marketplace. He pointedly called out Kamala Harris's price control plan for food prices, which I've written about previously. He talks about both candidates, their economic plans are really favoring more corporate interests over small businesses. There is a very interesting profile that, if you want to learn more about it, I would recommend to our listeners. In June in the New York Times, and they asked him kind of, what does libertarianism mean to me? And he says, libertarianism has always meant the freedom for peaceful people to make their own decisions about their lives without government interference. I've always said that if you're living your life and not using force, fraud, coercion, theft, or violence, your life's your life. Your body is your body. Your business is your business. And your property is your property. It's not mine, and it's not the government's. And I thought that was a very interesting and succinct and appealing way to kind of put it. So he's a younger guy, and so I think if people get to know him, maybe he will have a more outsized influence in deciding the future of the campaign than one might imagine. And especially if, when we get down to election day, we're in this, same scenario where every race is a point or two one way or the other. Remember, he's at 2% in the polls in Pennsylvania, and he already has some name recognition in Georgia. So don't sleep on Chase Oliver. If he gets a significant amount of votes, that could really decide who wins in November.
This year is PRI's 45th anniversary, and perhaps some of the audience might not know this, but our roots are libertarian. Sir Anthony Fisher and Robert North, our founders, were strong libertarians. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman were supporters of PRI, and these principles are absolutely manifested in the work that we do. Our research is based on classical liberalism, classical liberal economics, democratic capitalism, free markets, free trade, limited government, individual responsibility. So thanks so much to our listener who wrote in that letter, and we're able to go back to our roots here and let our audiences know.
And two, and Chase Oliver made the point, I watched an interview he did following the debate, and he said, no one on the stage is talking about classical liberalism, talking about things in these terms. He's probably right. We analyzed last week, it was kind of sound bites and off-the-cuff musings, and it wasn't really, and rehearsed lines certainly, wasn't really a serious debate about philosophy on either side. So he's an interesting candidate, and thanks to our listener, anytime someone has interesting ideas to discuss, we always like to talk about those and dive in on them here on our podcast. So this week on our podcast, it's kind of the end of our look back at this year's legislative session. And we have our old friend, Bartlett Cleland, who is our senior fellow in tech and innovation. And we talk about all things tech policy in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. on the national level. So we talk a lot about the bills on AI. We talk about driverless cars. We talk about social media companies, disruption of traditional media companies. And we look ahead, how would a Trump or a Harris be on tech policy over the next 4 years? And we look a little back. How will a Biden administration be remembered on tech policy? So if you're interested in all things tech, this week's episode is for you.
Thanks so much, Tim. And thanks to all for listening. And here's Bartlett Cleland.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
Bartlett, it's great to have you back on Next Round to talk about all things tech. So let's start with a look at the hot tech issues in California. Perhaps the biggest issue, once again, has been lawmakers targeting social media companies for the harms they have supposedly caused on issues like fentanyl, child safety, and human trafficking. So surprisingly, you're seeing support across party lines on these issues. Share your thoughts on these measures with our listeners and the larger question of the role, if any, the state government should have in these areas.
Sure, and thanks, Ro, for having me back. Always enjoy doing these. So to the question on social media, to look at it broadly, I think it would be a poor place to start the conversation to ignore that there are bad things that happen on social media. They certainly do. Social media is nothing if not a reflection of who we are as humanity, not least because there's so many people on social media. But because of that, then unfortunately, bad things happen. So, people do use it to peddle drugs or to peddle children or whatever. And we do need to pay attention to these things. What is shocking to me over and over is that states seem to be unaware that these have been issues that have been around for a long time and they actually have been tackling, not necessarily on social media, but in other ways. And what disturbs me most is that the go-to solution often seems to be the political, which is how do we now crack down, so to speak, on big air quotes here, big tech, because I don't buy into this belief of big tech, but for the moment, what can we do to go after big tech as opposed to what can we do to continue fighting these problems with our society generally? And so what are some of the proposals? Well, some of the proposals say big tech needs to collude with us. So we're going to push them to expose information that they're outside their terms of service, otherwise wouldn't be legal to share, et cetera. But they need to share it with government so we can go after the bad guys. This is why we have a whole criminal justice system, not least of which includes things like warrants. If you can prove your case to a judge, you get a warrant, you get to go after people. What a lot of these proposals do is almost ignore that we have this system set up. And I think therein is the problem. It's not that the state government shouldn't be involved. In fact, I think it's perfectly fine for state government certainly to be aware and to continue their policing activities in a way that they always have. So different states, that's different levels of engagement. Same with local police. But it does not mean that they should be given some extraordinary policing powers or expansion of state government authority simply because something is happening in social media and not where, on the street corner or in the classrooms or on the playgrounds. We have rules for this and we should follow them.
So within the past few weeks, we saw a federal appeals court uphold a lower court ruling blocking key provisions of California's child online safety law, which was enacted in 2022, and the judge cited First Amendment concerns in the ruling. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think the courts got it right here? And how do you balance what might be, these actually competing interests of free speech and protecting kids?
Well, working backwards on that one, I actually don't see, I'm one of these crazy people that when I learned about the founding of the country and the protections that we were given, I was all in. I bought into this notion that we should have liberty and that, in fact, in our country, we are protected from government going too far rather than the other way around, which is the way most countries are organized. And so I actually don't see a competition between free speech and protecting kids. What I see is that one of the best ways to protect kids is to make sure that we have absolutely well-grounded and well-respected liberties in this country, of which it includes free speech. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that you leave kids unprotected. I understand that for the most part, kids are not able to protect themselves. And so we have to do what we can as adults, as society, to make sure they're protected. But that's not about tearing down other people's liberties, other people's empowerment, so that we can go after fill in the blank, whatever it is that somehow we can make a case harms children. So specifically, then to the California case, I do think the courts got it right. You cannot force companies. So companies are considered an individual for purposes of the law. It's called a legal fiction. So we speak of corporations as being an individual, and they have much of the same free speech rights, not exactly, but much of the same free speech rights that you and I have. And so forcing them to say something or forcing them not to say something is a violation of their ability to speak freely. And I think that is, again, the best way to protect kids. Now, like I said, you don't ignore the kids, which means what happens? Just like if I was taking my children on a trip somewhere with some questionable neighborhood, I may or may not want to avoid those because I don't want the kids that see the signs or the kind of institutions, as it were, the establishments that are in that neighborhood. That's up to me as a parent, guardian, teacher, etc., to make sure that the kids are seeing, put in front of them what the kind of thing they should be seeing and trying to avoid the bad material. The same online. If you have access to internet in your home, you have a fundamental responsibility as a parent to make sure the kids are not seeing harmful material. Same in schools, libraries, I don't know, wherever else they might be getting access.
So AI was another major issue in the legislature this year, with about 30 different bills proposed this session. One of the highest profile measures was SB 1047, which would require companies to test the safety of AI technologies before they are released to the public. The bill would also let the state attorney general sue these companies if the technology caused, quote, serious harm. So what are your thoughts on this bill and the others? It seems like another area where government could be stifling innovation in free markets to the detriment of Californians.
Yes, ma'am. You've got it. You're right on correct. So there are, to me, all these AI bills. Well, hang on, let me backtrack. There are plenty of AI bills that are absolutely okay, and some are even good. So what would fall into that category? I think legislation that calls for the state to study artificial intelligence, to keep abreast of developments in artificial intelligence, inventory what the state government is currently using AI for. And maybe where they could use it further. These are all fantastic pieces of legislation. What's not fantastic is the specific one, or any that are like it. Anything that requires government to give some pre-approval for an innovator to be Mother May I think are very poor ideas. Not least of which, and this is the biggest problem with a lot of the legislation. Honestly, all the legislation on AI is just definitionally. What in the world are we talking about? It's not that there are stupid people. It is that artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, which is what we're talking about, is merely software. And once you get into the world trying to define software, it is really extraordinarily difficult to cabin with legal language what you are limiting the legislation to target. And so it is very hard to say we want to pre-approve any advances in generative AI when that could mean something as simple, and we've heard this example a million times, I'll use it again, things like autocomplete on your if you're typing a sentence and you're on your Apple phone, for example. I believe Android works the same way. It'll actually predict a couple words ahead of what you're typing. Sometimes just a word, sometimes a couple words. That's AI at work. And most people right now are going, oh, well, that's been around forever. Yes, AI, as we understand it, has been around for decades. It's nothing new, which also feeds into this notion of now do we have to go backwards and get approval for all the AI we're currently using? It used to be called machine learning. And if so, we're opening ourselves up to virtually every industry everywhere, getting almost all of their most basic business functions approved before they use it, before they use the software that might be driving it. Remember, a lot of companies create their own software. So we're not just talking about commercial off-the-shelf software. We're talking about all kinds of software built specifically for the company, built internally for the company, et cetera. So it's it's a very messy area, which is exactly back to why do I support other legislation that studies that? These are the kind of questions that legislators, long before they get around to doing any kind of legislation, really have to get their heads around and stop using the buzz terms and stop using the headlines from newspapers as the way they legislate.
So another major issue, and one that I've written about, was legislation targeting social media companies for their alleged role in harming daily and weekly newspapers in the state. And there were multiple measures that would either increase taxes or some sort of regulation on social media companies to address their supposed impact on the decline in newspapers. Now, we saw at the end of the session, Google reached a deal with the state to avoid the legislation in exchange for paying to some new state quasi-backed nonprofit that would give money to struggling papers. But yet a lot of people are not happy with that, including the Senate pro tem. They argue, there should be a more sufficient measure here. So what are your thoughts on these measures? And really the larger question of, are social media companies really hurting traditional media outlets? And to me, it seems like these efforts beg a larger question. Should government really be in the business of trying to keep newspapers afloat in the first place?
Yeah, so I think your last question tips the hand at the right answer here. This isn't even a particularly technology. In fact, the answer is not a technology answer at all. This just happens to be an example that because of technological disruption, I don't think government should ever be in the business of keeping afloat any industry that can't keep itself afloat. No matter how you slice it economically, we call that rent seeking. And that is to ultimately leverage government to somehow do for you what you can't do for yourself in the marketplace. Listen, I've heard a lot of competing theories as to why newspapers are dying. Is it because there's not enough local news? Is it because it's a physical product and people don't want that? I mean, are they too biased in their reporting? I don't know what the answer is, but what I do know is that they apparently are not selling as many newspapers. And how do I know that? Is because they can't achieve the kind of advertising revenue that they used to achieve. And that really is what's happening here. That is the real issue. This is all about selling ad space. And if newspapers can somehow get propped up by the government, they can continue collecting their advertising money and paying into the coffers of whoever owns them. So, which then is just simply a transfer of taxpayer dollars into corporate pockets, providing zero value for taxpayers, and just lining the pockets of the people, the organizations that own the newspapers. So I think all around, I mean, I guess God bless Google that they're willing to capitulate to this, but all around, it's a shakedown, and Google is having to pay up to try to avoid some other consequence that they should never be facing in the first place, because other social media, they're winning. They found a better way to deliver a product in a way that meets people where they are, and that's what we should all hope for every industry.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted.
One area of tech policy in California where things seem to be going pretty well is on driverless cars. And this is an issue near and dear to my heart because I flunked the eye test at the DMV and I do not have a driver's license. So we're seeing Cruise and Waymo expand their offerings of driverless robo-taxis and ride sharing. Yet they're still facing regulatory pushback, especially from city governments who are concerned about honking and accidents. So bring us up to speed with tech policy with driverless cars. And do you think this is somewhere where government is getting it right? Are there warning signs of bad policies coming up next year at city halls? or the state capitol?
So I was just, this is a great question. I was literally just last week in Phoenix and was amazed by the number of Waymos I saw, which I guess is what we're calling them. I don't really know what to call them, but the Waymo cars carrying people around the city of Phoenix, including right from the hotel I was at. A good friend of mine took one to the airport and videotaped the whole thing, which was kind of cool. But I had a very interesting discussion, and leads to your question about could there be bad policies. I was in an Uber with a group of people right behind a Waymo, parked at the hotel. We were getting ready to leave, and one of the people in the car pointed to it. They're very distinctive looking, and said, "Oh, would you ever trust that?" And I said, "100% yes." I didn't even think. I just said yes. And she whipped her head around, and looked at me as if to say, "Oh, you really are crazy, or you're just a complete technophile." And then the guy sitting next to me was like, "Really? Why are you so sure you would take one?" And I said, "Well, the data." The data is that there are dramatically less problems with EVs, driverless cars, than there are with human operated vehicles. And this is true across all of transportation. The automated whatever is dramatically less dangerous. It causes a lot less problems than when there are human operators. And that's because, we're human. We have emotions. We get distracted. The computer doesn't get distracted. It doesn't have an emotional response. It simply slows down, speeds up, changes lane or whatever as it's supposed to, as it's been programmed to. The reason that people have, or at least a reason, people have such a negative response sometimes is one, well, I think some people are maybe want to be more controlling than I care about. I'm very happy to have the car drive for me. But number two, and I kind of get this, there is this notion that because I'm so used to having humans operate things, that must be the better way of doing things. When in fact the data just doesn't bear that out at all, and it's many orders of magnitude more likely that there will be an accident with a human operated vehicle. But that is also why, think about what makes it to the newspapers. It is the interesting, the odd, the one off. It's if it bleeds, it leads. So we relentlessly read stories about every time the horn goes off in a Waymo or some other automated vehicle runs into somebody. This stuff does happen, but it happens at an immensely lesser rate than human operated vehicles. So I think there is always a danger that there will be bad ideas or bad legislation. There are some places that are getting it right. I mentioned Phoenix, an area in the North Dallas area has a test bed for automated vehicles, and there are others around the country. I believe those will continue to grow. I believe as people get more, as Waymos in this case are more frequently sighted on the roads, people will get increasingly comfortable with seeing them, with then trying them, and it won't be that long, all things being equal, that people will get very comfortable. And I think that's when the threat of bad legislation, bad regulation will decrease. We're just not quite there yet, but we're getting there. Go to Phoenix and try the Waymo. I have to tell you, it's fascinating.
Let's look at federal tech policy. So the biggest issue we've seen in recent months, not surprisingly, is this ongoing fight over TikTok and the law enacted by Congress requiring its divestiture by Chinese interests. Now, this can be a little bit of a tricky one for free marketeers. We certainly don't want government requiring companies to sell themselves to more palatable owners for government, but yet there are real concerns about data privacy and the practices of the Chinese government. So what are your thoughts here, and what do you think is the right way free marketeers should approach this issue of the TikTok controversy?
Yeah, man, are you right on? I think this is a challenging one for free marketeers. Obviously, I count myself in that category. So going back several years, there were hearings on Capitol Hill about two companies. One, Huawei, did make lots of news a couple years ago. The other was ZTE. It was a cell phone company. There was an investigation in I believe that was a Judiciary Committee in the House, and they put out a lengthy report that, and they did hearing with people that not on the record, right? So classified information. And they reached the conclusion that these companies shouldn't operate in the US. And it ultimately led to the FCC trying to get money, and Congress did appropriate some money to rip out Huawei technology from our telecommunications system across the country. I think want to say they did a little over $1 billion. That was maybe a third or a fourth of the total dollars they thought it was going to take. And the money was to reimburse companies that had put in Huawei technology, and they were now going to have to take out that technology, put in new technology. So it was to buy the new technology plus the labor to get that switched out. And the notion was that the chips that Huawei were using in its servers could somehow collect information or transmit information to China if China were to flip a switch, so to speak. I'm dumbing all that down, and not least of which is because I don't understand the technology deeply enough at play. But here's why this matters to the TikTok debate. I could be convinced as a free marketeer that there is a real threat from international adversaries, economically or militarily. And certainly I want nothing to do with giving them easier access to data or to the market somehow that would play in their favor. If in fact they are flagged as an adversary to the U.S. or to U.S. interests. What I don't understand is why TikTok was kind of plucked out of the stream to make an example of, which is maybe the best I could say about what was done. If we're serious about technology being an adversary and we are serious about Chinese technology being a threat, then I think we could go to the example I gave, Huawei, which was already investigated, already determined by the House Judiciary Committee to be a threat, and we could actually appropriate the rest of the money to rip out the rest of the Huawei equipment that over this last decade have not been ripped out of our telecommunications system and replaced. But you shouldn't stop there. If we really are concerned about Chinese technology, then we should ban all Chinese software. We should ban all Chinese technology. And you need to look, if you bought a TV in the last, I don't know, let's say smart TV. So in the last 10 years, that thing was put together in China. That screen was made in China with some small exception. So you probably have Chinese technology, hardware and software in your house. You likely have other Chinese software downloaded on your mobile phone. So my point is, I could be convinced that this is a good idea, I think. But if it is, then we need to do it. The TikTok exception, I think at best, was just to make an example. And frankly, I think it had way more to do with trying to punish, quote, big tech than it had to do with really being concerned about Chinese adversarial issues.
So AI has also been a tricky issue for Congress and the Biden administration. Bring our listeners up to date. What are some of the regulatory and legislative issues related to AI that are being talked about in Washington? And what is an ideal policy from the federal government when it comes to AI?
Ideal policy. Well, let's talk about what's being talked about first. So a lot of the action's going on in the states, honestly, rather than the federal level. And why is that? Because, I don't know, a year and a half ago now, the Biden administration put out a new executive order on AI. And why do I emphasize new? Because Trump had put out an executive order on AI before that. The Biden AI order was much broader, much more invasive than that previous order on AI. Now, it still included good stuff. And I've mentioned some of the good stuff when I'm talking about California. So it had items like inventorying where AI is being used in the federal government, how it could be used in additional ways that could help various agencies, et cetera. It also included a lot of Mother May I provisions for the general use of AI, a lot of oversight by the federal government, creating I'll just call it Department of AI, not what they call it, to oversee development of AI. So there were a lot of really bad ideas in that executive order as well. So that process, the process of the executive order working through the agencies and whatnot is still, I wouldn't say it's at the very beginning of the process, but it's still in the middle of the process. They're still working through all that. And in the meantime, there's not been a whole lot going on in a serious way on Capitol Hill to push AI policy. Nothing that seems that it's going to pass certainly this session. And I anticipate that is because we're waiting to hear back in a lot of cases from around the government as to here's what we're doing, here's the things that are helpful, here are things that are not helpful, et cetera. And so I think that's kind of where we are. That said, I got to tell you, AI has gotten, I think at the federal level, very little attention, again, particularly as related to the states. And maybe that's as it should be. That said, I'll say again, because I do think it's important to say, I do think it's good to understand where technology is being used in the administration of government and how it's being used, because I am constantly stunned by how little our legislators and administrators know about the technology being used under their own noses. And they should have some idea what that technology is, and how it's being used to benefit constituents, so that when they're making new regulations or writing new legislation, they're taking that into account rather than just writing duplicative rules or legislation.
So as we tape this podcast, we're in the middle of an extremely competitive presidential election, and one that will certainly have a big impact on the future of tech policy. And it's kind of been interesting to see, you see Silicon Valley and tech leaders are kind of lining up on both sides of the campaign, some in kind of untraditional ways. So let's talk a little bit about the tech policies of both candidates, starting with Kamala Harris. What does her record as Attorney General or Senator say about the type of tech policy she might embrace as president? Do you think she would chart a different course from what we've seen from the Biden administration on tech, or do you think she will largely the same in her policies?
So at a meta level, and no pun intended there, I think at the large level, probably not much change. That is to say, I think there's still going to be a desire for command and control. And I'm thinking primarily, we're just talking about it, but primarily about AI. But just in general, I think that's going to be the approach. Very cautionary, very permission first approach in a lot of spaces. And then as I think very broadly on tech, I think in broadband, where she has had a direct hand supposedly in the monies that have been approved for broadband, a whole lot of layering in of other social issues into something as simple as rolling out broadband more completely across a state. So we'll pick a simple one. If you want government money to build out further in the state to areas that don't have broadband access, you must use organized labor, union approved work. So there are a whole lot of problems with that, even if you like that as an idea. For example, they're just simpler enough workers to do all the work, is a quick one. Other things like price controls. And so as I think about that piece on price controls, I also think of her tax notions, which were very heavy on price controls. And so I would be shocked to see that somehow in tech, the technology would broadly be treated differently. Now, that said, I could see that in the back in this AI realm that there might be some changes. I think there are going to have to be changes because time is advancing. We will learn new things. In fact, from the time when that AI executive order was put out in the Biden administration, there have already been changes in AI and that, like how much power it's likely to use, et cetera. That given that people are using it differently than was anticipated, and so I just believe that AI is moving so rapidly. For example, there will have to be changes. I don't think the overall approach will change. I do think some of maybe the details will change. But frankly, until we hear more from her on policy interests and kind of where she's going, it's a little hard to figure out what she might what she stands for right now. She says she's changed her mind on a lot of issues, so I'm not even sure looking at her background is all that instructive. But certainly, without her saying, "Here are my priorities," it's really hard to understand whether tech will even rank as something that interesting to her or not. One other note: we know that I think I mentioned this earlier that the Biden administration spent a decent amount of time jawboning technology companies into doing into moderating certain activities on their social media sites. By jawboning, I mean kind of like the mob might have jawboned you if you were a business operator in their neighborhood. They lean on you. They say, do this or else. I strongly suspect that kind of activity would continue, which is pretty odious for government to try to force big business to do its bidding. We also know there's some constitutional problems with actually all kinds of constitutional problems with that. But I suspect those same kind of activities would continue.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment. But first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Now, turning to Donald Trump, he's been very vocal on tech policy and certainly chartered a clear course on tech during his administration. So how do you think a second Trump administration would approach tech policy? And what are some of the previews that he's been giving on the campaign trail on his approach to tech? And do you think a second Trump administration would approach tech policy and regulation different from the first administration?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one to me. Putting aside kind of everything one thinks about or might think about Trump or Harris for that matter, and just watching what I'll just call evolution of a candidate is interesting. So we did have a very clear direction under Trump, and it wasn't always great for technology. There was a whole lot of let's get control of social media, let's force them to do this, that, or the other, let's threaten them with antitrust breakup, etc. Even though we've continued that same approach under Biden, a lot of that started with things Trump said or did in his administration. What has been fascinating to me is in the last few months, the party platform has completely changed its tone on technology. Seems fairly optimistic now. It's not well developed, but it has changed the tone. Trump himself has, a dozen times now, said things along the line that accentuate the value of AI, that talk about the value of data centers, that talks about the urgency of, I think he says he wants to double the electricity production in the country to further tech interests. I am fascinated watching that kind of change in temperament. Now, that said, he's still said some rather negative things about social media, or I should say specific social media sites. That still may or may not be a point of contention for his going forward. But I do think that he has signaled that there is going to be some real difference in a potential second administration, at the very least around AI. And he had a pretty good executive order on AI before, but he seems to be all in on that. He seems to be all in on creating the electricity to continue to push forward our data-powered economy. So I think there's been some change. It will be very interesting to see, if he is president, how this might roll out and how many different places it might roll out to, meaning how many different topics. Will this stay kind of situs just in social media and in AI, or will it grow to be more inclusive of things like broadband, et cetera? I don't know the answer, but I do think it's interesting space to watch going forward.
So as we close, of course, with a presidential election on the horizon, we're also going to see naturally a change in administration. So from your vantage point, how will the Biden administration be remembered on tech? And what are some of the things that you think they got right and some of the things that you think will have a negative lasting legacy on tech?
Well, working backwards, I've mentioned a couple of them. I think this jawboning activity, there was a Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court didn't shut it down completely. I think that there might be a revisitation of this going forward, but I suspect this kind of activity has been going on a long time. It's not unique to tech, but because social media touches First Amendment, I think it should be given, and it is given more scrutiny by the courts. I think that's a bad precedent. I think the breadth of this executive order on AI is a little shocking, and I'm afraid. I guess over my lifetime, I've seen executive orders go from something you barely heard about to becoming huge deals. We've seen various candidates at times say, well, if I can't, I'll go to Congress, and if they don't act, I'm just going to do it myself. That's great, except there are plenty of appropriate limitations on the power of the executive. Perhaps there should even be more. But taking a look at the executive orders might be a good place to start. What else under Biden? the way NTIA is administering the broadband funds that Congress approved is another example of bad government, where the NTIA is insinuating all kinds of requirements that were never contemplated by government. And then the other big thing that has changed is, and try to do this quickly, is the Supreme Court has spoken on several issues, but not least of which is in the regulatory world. And people may or may not have heard of this, but there's this thing called Chevron deference, and it basically gives a lot of authority to the regulatory agencies to fill in the gaps, to assume what Congress meant, to be pejorative about it, and that has been struck down. And because of that, legislation theoretically will have to be written a whole lot better, or for an agency to act at all, or if it does act, it's likely that its actions will be immediately taken to court and often struck down. So I think some of the bad behavior will be limited, is my point, regardless of what Biden administration did. The next administration will be in a different spot starting because the underlying laws have fundamentally changed. There aren't a whole lot of things, honestly, that I think the Biden administration got right on technology. I mentioned a couple of those in the AI executive order, and I think that should continue. In fact, maybe they should spend more time taking a look at how government is delivering services, how government could better deliver services with the insinuation of whether it's AI or other technologies, so that constituents get more direct benefit for their dollars being taken, as opposed to it goes into some hole that we don't really understand what value individually we're getting back. I think these kind of things could be a lot easier to access, a lot easier to understand, with the insinuation of more technology. That probably does mean ultimately fewer government workers, which I think most people would be happy to see, except those workers themselves, and better information for people and easier interaction with government. So I think some of the studies that they're doing, some of the looking at inventory is good. So I guess if I was going to pick something, that is one thing I would land on. A lot of the rest has been driven by Congress, and then when it gets handed over to the executive branch, they tend to make a mess of what was intended. So hopefully a lot of that will change in a new administration, regardless of who wins. Hopefully they will take the promise of technology more seriously, the opportunity for the United States to continue to be a global leader in technology, take all that into account, and even if they don't have pro-tech policies, at least don't have anti-tech policies. That would be a step in the right direction for either administration to take.
Thanks so much, Bartlett. Technology is moving so fast that we really ought to have you in all the time. Thanks again.
And thank you for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.